Hello everyone, welcome to the Universal Peace Federation. My name is Ray Lapalkin, and at the Universal Peace Federation we're promoting interdependence, mutual prosperity, and universally shared values. So if those resonate with you, please get in touch with us. Today's program is titled Women in Leadership Part 1. And as we're all aware, women are taking a leading role in world affairs, particularly what I'm appreciative of is peace-building initiatives. And we're going to be watching a video in a short while on a webinar that took place on women who are taking leadership positions here in America and some of their stories. But first I'd like to read a speech by one of our co-founders, Dr. Hak Ja Han Moon. It's entitled, The 21st Century and the Mission of Women. Women leaders from China, United States, and from around various associations here in Korea, and leaders in the Women Federation for World Peace. It's a great honor for me to speak at this event and encourage all the women leaders from around the world who have come together to seek the way to bring a world of peace and to affirm the coming of the global age of women. With the 21st century only a few years away, we stand in a position to experience the upheavals of the 20th century along with a new and different century in our lifetime. This does not mean simply that we will span 2 centuries. Since the providence that permeates human history is carried out in units of 2,000 years, there's a great significance in concluding the 20th century and preparing for the 21st. Though history is apt to change, the rate and extent of recent changes have been so wide and unpredictable that we have come to fear change. In the society of the future, in which science and technology will have been developed to a high degree, will humankind find happiness? In the information society of the 21st century, what kind of lifestyle will people lead? How will the pressing problems of humanity that darken our future be resolved? What will be done about such issues as the establishment of a principled morality and new values, and the problem adolescents face crimes, drug, AIDS, and other diseases, war and starvation, and religious conflict? Without finding a fundamental answer, the hopes of humanity for the 21st century will never be realized. We need to address these problems not as problems of individual nations. We need to address them as those of humanity. The time has come to resolve our problems and bring clarity to our future through the new expression of truth revealed by heaven. On the verge of entering the 21st century, when we examine history, we see that men have been ignorant of the true value of women and have not treated women fairly. The women's movement of modern times, which began with the 19th century campaign of Western women to gain suffrage, has continued to develop under the banner of women's liberation. In general, it has been a movement carried out against men to restore women's rights, including the extension of women's rights, gender equality, and the women's labor movement. Therefore, the mainstream of the women's movement generally took the form of opposing men only for the sake of women. The movement I am carrying out through the Women's Federation for World Peace is different from the American women's movement. It is a women's movement not only for women, it is for everyone, carried out on the foundation of the new teaching centered on God's ideal of creation. Chauvinists assert that men are destined naturally to assume the superior position, and men and women are designed for certain roles they are meant to play. Their theory is that men and women are born with different natures, and that accordingly their roles also differ. They believe that men and women naturally assume the superior and the inferior positions, respectively, in terms of identity and status, and that men are established as a superior. I believe that feminists until now primarily have been responding to this view. They have tried to secure an equal status with men in all respects by imitating them and assuming the same roles as men. In spite of their efforts, complete gender equality could not be achieved. This was because they did not know the essence of the problem. The fact that the role of women and their inborn nature differ from those of men does not mean that the value of women is less than that of men and that their status is inferior. The unhappiness of women stems from not realizing the preciousness of their God-given original nature and their role. Problems arose from the fact that many women forgot what they possessed and tried to imitate the nature of the role of men as if men were the exemplars for women. My esteemed women leaders, Women are the individual embodiments of truth, representing one of the two natures of the incorporeal God, who possesses yin and yang in both external form and internal nature. Therefore, women are not in competitive relationship with men who represent the other side of God. Women are not the assistants of men. They are the independent object partners who make the world whole. When God created men and women, God established them as the ideal object partners of each and made it so that they can become one through true love. From the perspective of true love, women are the perfect object partners for the love of men, and in regard of their value, men and women are absolutely equal. The fact that the natures of men and women are different does not pose a problem. Those differences are factors that bring on the stimulation of love. In the original ideal, a man and a woman united in true love have the right of equal position and equal status. Moreover, a man and women united in true love have the right to participate as equals, and through their love, they can always be together. A man and woman united in true love have the right of inheritance, through which each shares what belongs to the other as a second owner. As you can see, a man and woman united through God's ideal of true love are created as completely equal beings in terms of value. They have the right of equal position, participation, and mutual ownership. Therefore, men and women are not in an antagonistic relationship in which they need to imitate, covet, or somehow acquire the other's nature and role. Instead, they are in a relationship in which they share with one another by giving what is theirs to the other through true love. Thus, each perfects the other and becomes one with the other. From now, humanity and humankind has no choice except to live in an increasingly globalized and pluralized society. In the future, women will have a noble role in the family unit and the entire society as well. We could even say the role of the mother shapes history by bearing, giving birth, and nurturing the future of humanity. Respected women representatives, traditionally, history has continued under the leadership of men. Most have misled humanity through brutal force and have created conflict and division in irrational societies. Consequently, there is a mountainous pile of historic legacies that need to be dispensed with, as well as many pressing problems. For humanity to usher in this 21st century with hope, the contribution of women is absolutely necessary. To achieve this goal, it requires a cooperation and international activities to enlighten women from various nations. A time will come when the leaders of nations will realize keenly their international relations and the condition of this planet's environment. On this basis, they will have no choice except to prioritize the common good of the world above their national interest and to translate this realization into action. I hope this meeting and exchange with these women leaders will set an example of women's international cooperation for constructing an ideal world. I encourage cooperation of women leaders from both nations that will serve as a turning point in achieving peace in the world, marking the progress of history toward one world of peace, transcending the walls of nationality, race, and religious belief. Thank you so much for listening. May God's blessings be with you and your families. So at this time, I'd like you to watch this video. Again, it's Women in Leadership, and we'll get an idea again of women participating in leadership roles here in America. Well, enjoy.
Good afternoon. I'm Cindy Pfeiffer. Welcome to the Women in Leadership of the Washington Times Foundation webinar titled Influence and Leadership of the United States First Ladies, Perspectives of the Chief of Staff and Key Personnel. When looking at nation building, both at home and abroad, there are those working behind the scenes, affecting changes of a nation in what is referred to as soft diplomacy. This fulfills the task of building bridges and brings about reconciliation. Our program would like to honor the presidential first ladies and their chief of staff and key personnel. These fine groups of women truly make an impact in our nation, as you will come to understand when hearing their stories. I would like to introduce our moderator, Mrs. Vicki Tiahrt. She was a former president of the Congressional Club from 2005 to 2006. The Congressional Club is a service organization for spouses of members of Congress, of the Supreme Court, and of the administration. So Vicki's husband was former Congressman Todd Tiahrt of Kansas. She served also on the First Ladies Luncheon Committee during the Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations, and chaired the Congressional Club for Mrs. Laura Bush in 2001. Vicki holds a degree in psychology and speech pathology and serves on several nonprofit boards, including Best Friends Foundation that promotes core values with high school students. Other nonprofits she works with includes the Congressional Wife Speakers, Sarah's Hope, the Global Vitaligos Foundation, and the American Prayer Initiative. And her most important role, she says, that she likes is being that of a Christian wife, mom, and grandmother. So we are welcoming Vicki Tiahrt.
Thank you, Cindy. Welcome to all of our viewers today, and especially to our presenters, Cherie, Jean, and Alexa. The Washington Times Foundation is committed to honoring the legacy of women leaders by engaging them in its mission, devoted to America's founding ideals and to public service. As a project of the Washington Times Foundation, Women in Leadership encourages the highest ideals in cultural values and public mindedness in an effort to build bridges of understanding. It is so needed and so timely today. Women in Leadership aims to bring women leaders together beyond any specific political leaning or religious traditions through reaching out to the community, building co-prosperity, affirming religious and racial harmony, and promoting stable families. Today, our first presenter is Cherie Harder. Cherie served as Director of Policy and Projects for First Lady Laura Bush, 2007 and 2008. She also served the President as a special assistant to President George Walker Bush. Currently, Ms. Harder is president of the Trinity Forum, 2008 to right now, a nonprofit organization which cultivates and promotes the best of Christian thought to equip leaders to lead wisely. I give you Cherie Harder.
First, I want to just thank Cindy, Tom McDevitt, Dr. Michael Jenkins for the invitation to join you all today. It's a real pleasure. And I'm particularly disappointed I'm not able to join you live. I would have loved to have heard the comments from Alexa Ward and Jean Becker. We'll look forward to watching those later. But it's a real pleasure just to be able to join you to talk a little bit about the influence, the power, the scope of First Ladies. And it's one of those positions, I think, where it's often underestimated or even overlooked. But of course, the scope of the influence is extraordinary. And the amount of effort that so many First Ladies put into the work is really astounding. That was certainly true of the First Lady that I had the honor and privilege of getting to work for, Laura Bush. I worked for Mrs. Bush in 2007 and 2008. As her Director of Policy and Projects. What that means basically, which might be a little bit confusing in that one might think, well, the First Lady, of course, does not set policy, and that's true. She's not an elected official. But as the First Lady, she has extraordinary scope to influence, to raise awareness, to convene, to offer hospitality, and even in the whole realm of global diplomacy. And I'll try to talk about a few of those points just briefly. And in many ways, I think there's kind of an underestimation of just the influence that happens with that. In terms of public awareness, one of the projects that I had the privilege of working with Mrs. Bush on was in 2007. It was at the time that the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief in Africa, or PEPFAR, as well as the Presidential Malaria Initiative, PMI, both were coming up for reauthorization in Congress. I think history has already shown, and will show even more, what an extraordinary achievement both of these initiatives were, just in terms of the lives saved, the family saved, just the human, just the influence in terms of human well-being across an entire continent in the world. it really is extraordinary. But as they were coming up for reauthorization, there's always, of course, people who may not disagree, who may not agree, who may not be aware of just how important it is. It's not the same priority for them. And so one of the things a First Lady can do is through her own initiatives and activities, increase public awareness of a wonderful program that was saving hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of lives. So one of the things Mrs. Bush did was actually take a trip to Africa, just to give you a sense of how much work and activity is packed into such a short time. In 5 days, Mrs. Bush, her staff, security, and she brought along some members of the press as well, went to Africa and back, went to 4 different countries, engaged in at least 30 different activities and visits and sites, met with a couple of world leaders before arriving back home, all within 5 days. So in 5 days, we left DC, we went to Mali, Senegal, Mozambique, and Zambia, returned home, having met with, I think it was 2 world leaders and engaged in 30 different site visits or activities later. That's the kind of schedule that a First Lady often keeps up. It's really pretty extraordinary as a staff member. It's both exhilarating and can be utterly exhausting, but of course, it is an amazing opportunity. During her trip, she would visit different PEPFAR sites where the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief was actually being implemented, saving lives. She would meet with many of the people who had received, whether it was bed nets to prevent malaria as part of the President's malaria initiative, or had been receiving health care through PEPFAR or education or training, and efforts to train the trainers as well. And by doing so, she also brought along a bunch of media too. The First Lady's plane was sort of divided into 3 sections, with Mrs. Bush and her staff closest to the front, the second section being Secret Service and protection, and the media were usually kept in the seats towards the back, with Secret Service sort of in between the media and the First Lady and her staff. But she would go back and talk with them, as well as bring them along to a lot of the sites so that they too could see what was happening in different places across Africa. That came right at a time that I mentioned PEPFAR was up for reauthorization. As we all know, it was indeed reauthorized, and is, I think, a vital part and a really noble part of President Bush's legacy, from here on out. And the result of that initiative is that literally millions of lives probably have been saved. Hundreds of thousands of children are no longer orphans. Malaria in particular would affect kids between essentially babies and 6-year-olds were the age group most affected. So there are many people alive today because of that presidential initiative and because it was reauthorized. A second way that I think First Ladies can exert a large influence just in terms of their completely non-political or non-partisan activities is through their use of the convening power that attends a First Lady and the extension of hospitality. There are many times in which invitation to the White House, non-political invitations, can actually help forge really important relationships and understandings that pave the way for important progress to be made, as well as the sort of soft power, one could call it, of including other people, including other groups, making them feel heard and welcome, as well as elevating some of the key issues that the First Lady personally cares about. One example of this was Mrs. Bush's sponsorship, leadership, and involvement in the National Book Festival every year. Many of you will know that Mrs. Bush's background is as a librarian. Reading, books, literacy have always been terribly important to her. And one of the ways one can increase interest in support for that is by extending hospitality and convening people to talk about it. And of course, the National Book Festival was an extraordinary example of that. Mrs. Bush certainly wasn't alone in working on that, but her leadership, her name, her involvement brought a lot of attention, certainly elevated its reach, its visibility, its impact. The fair that was the National Book Festival brought many of our greatest authors to one place. And of course, people then thronged to see them, to hear from them, to hear readings and the like. And it was a way, a wonderfully inspiring, a hospitable way of drawing awareness, attention, and support for an issue that's very dear to her heart, which is increasing reading in America. So that's a second way, I think, that First Ladies can influence real leadership and real influence through hospitality and through their own convening power. A third way, which may be a little bit less intuitive than some of the others, is I think Mrs. Bush played an extraordinary role in some forms of global diplomacy. And what do I mean by that? One of the things that Mrs. Bush did that had very little attention at the time is, as a librarian, there were librarians in nations that were had restricted freedoms that really looked to her. And there were times that she would speak, would be broadcast to librarians in places like Cuba or other places. In addition, one of the big projects that she worked on while I was working for her was a luncheon for other First Ladies at the UN General Assembly. It's hard to kind of overstate just what a big project that was. And as an aside, just as a sense of the workload that a First Lady deals with, during 2007, the year that I was there at the White House, Mrs. Bush had over 176 different appearances or projects. Now, some of those could be as, relatively small as, say, a photos and a meeting with the 4-H winners. But it could range from that to planning and hosting a luncheon for over 100 First Ladies at the UN General Assembly, and did all that within a year. And of course, even a small event with a First Lady is quite a production. There's a lot that goes into it. There's briefing papers to be written. There's lots of details to be nailed down. There's lots of people who need to be invited, vetted before they're admitted to the White House. But an assembly, a luncheon for a bunch of First Ladies at the UN General Assembly is a huge undertaking. And there's a lot of considerations that go into it. There's a lot of both coordination with the State Department, with the National Security Council, and the like. But it was a way of convening all of the First Ladies, well, not all, but so many of them across the country, across the world. First Ladies from rogue nations were not invited, but First Ladies from nations that were not rogue or hostile regimes were, and getting to meet them. Helping to forge relationships across countries. Many of those relationships, of course, lasted long beyond that luncheon. And it was a way of, extending hospitality to build positive relationships, which help set a foundation of communication and trust in terms of global diplomacy. And the First Lady has the scope to do that in a way that really no other position does. I think it's fair to say that Mrs. Bush performed all of those functions with extraordinary grace, finesse, humility, as well as just complete classiness. She was someone who took the role quite seriously, had a lot of ideas and initiatives, always seemed unruffled, and yet as a staff person working for her was constantly impressed just by the extraordinary stamina, as well as grace under pressure, under deadline, and often in cases when anyone would have been exhausted. It was something I think she modeled well. And the influence that she had and that she exercised, I think, left the world a better place. So thank you again for the invitation to talk with you just a little bit about some of the observations I had during the time that I had the privilege of serving Laura Bush as her Director of Policy and Projects in the White House. And I am sorry to miss what I'm sure is a fascinating gathering, but look forward to watching it later. Thanks again.
Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that. And if any of this resonates with you, men or women alike, please get in touch with us, and we could further our discussions on women's role in leadership here in America and throughout the world, and with Universal Peace Federation and the Women's Federation for Peace are doing to promote this. And what I like to do also, I'd always like to offer the biographies of our co-founders, Reverend Moon and his wife, Dr. Hak Jahan Moon. If you're interested in a copy, they're complimentary. Please get in touch with me and I'll get one out to you. Thank you so much.